Hello, and Happy New Year to everyone out there. We're very excited to bring you new content from Mesa Prieta, including a revamped Chat with the Archaeologist series. Also, continue to follow us on other platforms, social media, Facebook, Instagram, as well as here on our YouTube channel. And check out our website for updates. We're going to be working with Los Luceros State Historic Site again this year. And as a part of that partnership, we will be co-presenting the Mesa Talks series once again. We've already determined that the Mesa Talks are going to be online, at least for the first part of the year, much as they were last year. And we have yet to finalize the guest list. So again, stay tuned for which speakers will be talking on which topics when. As I said, we've got a revamped stream as well. And before we get into that, I just want to thank everyone out there who has supported our project, especially those who have visited our store, purchased merchandise, and are many, many very gracious donors. So thank you all for your support. It really helps not just this stream happen, but so much more that you don't really see behind the scenes. We're going to try to bring a little bit of that more forward, so you all can see what the donations are making happen. I'm really just the tip of the iceberg. So without any further ado, let's get into it. Ooh, small mistake there. We're going to get this presentation going. There we go. All right. As you can see, we've got a new intro. Wasn't that neat? So shout out to my boy Trevor Brolin for composing the music. Thank you so much. And I suggest that if you liked that, then you'll like the streams that he runs for Revel, which is a venue down in Albuquerque. So they've done a few videos called Revel Presents, and go check them out. So yeah, that's where our intro comes from. Next, I want to talk about updates from the Mesa. We do periodically give some updates on this channel, and you can hear my dog in the background. She's got a squeaky toy. You know, dogs will be dogs. So you'll probably hear that throughout the stream, I guess. What I was going to say is we do give updates on what's going on with Mesa Prieta and with the area around Mesa Prieta more broadly periodically on here. We're going to make that a little bit more structured, especially with the onset of 2021. There's a lot that people have been anticipating. Obviously, yep. Hold on, I gotta toss this ball. Go on. Thing is I can't keep her out of the room or she'll just be whining at the door. We've just got a little distraction on this stream. Like many other organizations in much of the world, the Mesa Prieta Petroglyph Project has been severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic. It has hampered many of our operations, and much of what we would normally be able to provide and bring to you was put on hold throughout 2020. So a lot of folks are sort of waiting with bated breath about when that stuff is going to start up. We're definitely getting a lot of inquiries about when are we going to open up for tours, what are the volunteer opportunities, what's going to happen with volunteer training. A lot of this is sort of in the works. We don't have much final to say right now, but we are going to bring all of this to you, hopefully. Of course, our hands are somewhat tied when it comes to abiding by state restrictions, especially around public health. So we have to operate within those, and we wouldn't want to compromise the health or safety of any of our visitors, patrons, supporters, volunteers, staff, or stakeholders. So we are playing it cautious. We do have to abide by state regulations, but we do hope to open up this year, perhaps later this year. In the meantime, we've got other digital content that we're working on in addition to these streams that we hope to be able to bring to you possibly before the tours open back up. Um, Also, volunteer opportunities. I've begun reaching out to those who have inquired about volunteering for petroglyph recording, and we hope to, in the next couple of months, reach out to returning and new prospective docents as well. So a lot of this information we're going to try to share as soon as possible. If you haven't signed up for our newsletter, please do so. We share all this information in the newsletter. Additionally, we try to share it on social media. Again, Facebook, Instagram, and here on the YouTube channel, which is where you can also find both on Facebook and YouTube the upcoming Mesa Talks series. So yeah, we'll be providing more information through all those outlets, as well as reaching out directly to anyone who has signed up. If you are still interested in volunteering for 2021, none of the trainings have happened yet, so head on over to our website and click the links. There are application forms both for docents and for volunteer recorders. That will let us know who you are and help us kind of fit you in a little bit better. And we do try to respond personally within a day or two, unless it's a weekend or holiday, uh, to get back to you about what to expect. So yeah, if you're interested, check out the website, subscribe to our newsletter, follow us on social media. Something that we're going to do today that is going to appear periodically in these videos, maybe not every month, but maybe every couple of months, are question roundups. And so this is just sort of a review of the questions that didn't get on the air. A lot of you have had some very interesting questions that you've come back with. And it's unfortunate that we couldn't get those on the air. Sometimes it was after the fact. Sometimes the stream was running long, and we had to kind of duck out. And other questions actually did make it on air, but maybe I just wasn't satisfied with the answer that I gave. So we can always come back to those too. We'll adjust this just a little bit more. Just want to make that bookshelf kind of more square in the background. So yeah, we're going to be doing question roundups. That's what we're going to start with as far as the content part goes for today. This is part of taking your feedback into account. And another piece of that feedback that we got is giving some more attention to what's going on in the news, so to speak. What archaeology studies are being released, covered, shared on social media, what's new, groundbreaking, what's interesting, what's controversial. We'll try to touch on those every installment. So we're going to introduce this new segment in this stream today, Archaeology in the News. So we'll have to save some time for that. And because of these new segments, we're going to have some more succinct lectures. Previously, we've been doing about 45 to 50 minutes for the flavor of the month sort of lecture, and we're shortening that. This way, there's more opportunity to talk about other topics rather than just the monthly topic that I happen to have picked. As much as I enjoy talking to you, just talking at you all for about an hour at a time, we can actually do better. And so part of that doing better is the archaeology in the news, shortening the lectures so that maybe you have more questions, but also we're going to open this channel up to other voices, have more folks come in, talk about archaeology, cultural anthropology, cultural heritage, both living and in the past. Well, all the guests are going to be living. And so, yeah, we're going to have some guest spots. We're starting to line up guests already for here. And hopefully they've got a lot more to share. We're hoping that this gets you more interested in archaeology, following more, of course, following us, but also following what else is going on out there. Maybe even reading more. Can't go wrong with reading more. But yeah, we're still keeping true to form. Typically, we will have our normal flavor of the month topic, whether that's chosen by me or by one of our guests. This month, we're not doing that. We've got plenty of content to fill our time slot with just the question roundup and just archaeology in the news. So that's what we're going to start with right here. All right, so loose ends, unaired questions, and a bit of roundup. First off, we have agriculture and irrigation from May. So we started doing this stream back in April. That was a very informal sort of introduction, planning, spitballing what we were going to do. May was our first sort of flavor of the month topic, where we spent a protracted period of time discussing, well, agriculture and irrigation because it was planting season. And yeah, I know some of you might think, May, planting season? Isn't that a bit late? Here where we are in the higher elevations that are only as high as the top of the mesa, winter weather, late frosts can continue into May. Last year we had a frost in June. So yeah, you don't really want to plant too much earlier because you don't want your sprouts to get knocked out. So that's why we did agriculture and irrigation, and we had an interesting question about acequias in Leiden. Now, for those of you who are tuning in from outside of New Mexico, or maybe not familiar with the area, Leiden is one of the communities along the foot of the mesa, along with Velarde, Okeowinge, and Ojo Caliente, as well as Embudo. So those who live in Leiden really are, many of our stakeholders. And so when we're talking about agriculture and irrigation here, it's very interesting to bring this up. The question was, were the acequias and headgates in Leiden created by native Pueblo peoples or by Spanish colonizers? We think that, for the most part, much of the ditch system as it exists and is used today is probably from the post-contact era. And so settler colonial communities had a very strong role in the planning and construction of these. Of course, as we covered back in May, that these systems are actually not necessarily imposed and entirely brought, but a combination of the irrigation measures that native peoples were doing prior to contact, as well as the irrigation practices and social structures around those practices that the Spanish brought in, both from European and especially actually from North African Moorish traditions. So the acequias we have today, probably constructed in the post-contact times with a substantial amount of involvement from settler colonial communities. But if that's not complicated enough, it gets more complicated, because there have been suggestions that some segments of these systems that we have in Leiden, Velarde, along the mesa, are actually derived from the pre-contact Pueblo irrigation systems. This is a matter of ongoing research, and other researchers are exploring this. So I can't speak to any of the details of that research because I don't want to give away someone's research before it's published. You'll all have to stay tuned. That's going to be a part of the updates from the Mesa. We'll also be covering research that's going on in the area and opening up guest spots to researchers that are working in the area. So Yeah, slightly complicated answer. It seems like just when we thought we had some idea of what was going on, there is some suggestion that at least parts or segments of this system uh, might date back to an earlier time. So, of course, here we have agriculture, three sisters, maize, beans, squash. But we didn't have agriculture, strictly speaking, as in uh, the cultivation of domesticated plants everywhere in the Americas. And in many places, local horticulture practices, that's raising and using plants that are very similar to their wild counterparts, uh, of course, precede the arrival of agriculture, even if the agricultural practices used domesticates from another region. So, one great example is in what we call the American Bottom, the greater Mississippi drainage. So, that includes tributaries like the Missouri and Ohio rivers. And especially along the Ohio River, we have mound builders in sort of later pre contact times uh, growing the domesticated plants like the Three Sisters, but prior to the arrival of those in the area, they were engaged in very sophisticated horticultural practices. Uh, and so we've also talked about that in the archaeoastronomy talk, that some of these earthen constructions were actually used as observatories to mark important points on the calendar when they sowed the fields, tended the fields, harvested, held feasts, and all of this was, of course, encoded into religious life and a religious cycle. So there, we've got clear evidence that the some of the agricultural technologies may have come in with the plants, but others technologies, also being observations, means of irrigating, etc., uh, may have preceded the arrival of the domesticates that were most common with. Were likely used with more northern domesticates, such as sunflowers, uh, but these techniques were derived from horticultural practices from plants that would be very difficult to distinguish from their wild counterparts. And thus, we really know that horticulture was happening in an earlier period because we have evidence of these same techniques and technologies being employed being employed, sorry, later with agriculture. There's some controversy in other regions, such as Death Valley. Now, Death Valley is a part of the Great Basin, which is one of the driest places on the continent, and at various periods in the past has given the Atacama Desert a run for its money for one of the driest places on Earth. Not only that, but Death Valley being at low elevation and southern latitude, very extreme southern latitude for the Great Basin, it's also the hottest place on Earth, having broken its own record just this past year in 2020. So, why do I bring up Death Valley when we're talking about agriculture? There's no maize, beans, corn, or squash there, is there? Well, not really. However, there in Death Valley, we had Namic-speaking hunter-gatherers, Shoshone, Paiute, Waisu. They were in direct contact with human speakers, such as the Mojave and their ancestors, the Patayan. Um, and we know that human speakers engaged in intensive agriculture along the banks of the Colorado River and its tributaries. The Colorado River, of course, forming the Grand Canyon and now the present day state line between California and Arizona. Forming both sides of the river means that there was agriculture in pre contact California. Not everyone agrees with that, but it is inarguably, demonstrably proven. And so, with these Namic speakers to the north in direct contact, we have to recontextualize what we see. We know that at the time of Euro-American contact in the Great Basin, which is very late, it's 19th century in the Great Basin. By that point, there was definitely intensive horticulture, especially in Owens Valley, which was a part of the seasonal rounds of those who lived in Death Valley, and included permanent villages of, well, permanent multi-ethnic villages of different speakers of different Numic languages. And we know those villages existed in Owens Valley. We know that those are the same languages that we that are still in Death Valley today, such as the Tumpisa language of the Timbisha Shoshone. And we know that the inhabitants of those villages, while they may have seasonally gone out, spread a wide net, cast a wide net, if you will, for the gathering and hunting of resources, they also tended fields in Owens Valley. And this only stopped because of the impact of flu pandemics and other pandemics, sometimes smallpox. Most of it was flu. And there was a taboo on continuing to use the field of someone who just passed away. You would let it go fallow for a year or two, at which point U.S. federal policy was to seize the unused land from the native peoples. And so the denial of these horticultural practices is really a part of native erasure, which is a thing that we're going to come back to later on today. But avoiding that rabbit hole, or saving that rabbit hole for later, we know that there was horticulture, and we know that sustained contact in this part of the American interior really didn't happen until the 49ers came through. So middle of the 19th century, some of the first written documentation of the indigenous peoples and their lifeways comes from it was published in the late 1880s, early 1890s. So it was collected in the latter half of the 19th century, by which point there are reports of Shoshone growing watermelon. Now, watermelon is a domesticate of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, I believe West Africa. Could be wrong on that, but certainly from Africa. So it is definitely an old world food. So what's it doing in Death Valley? Well, okay, so there certainly has been protracted contact for centuries in other regions that are in contact with the Great Basin. So if we think about coastal California, the mission system had already been established and collapsed. And similarly in the Southwest, as there was a Spanish colonial presence for centuries prior. So and we know that the Pueblos and coastal Californians were trade partners with the nomadic peoples of the Great Basin, such as the Shoshone, Guaycú, and Paiute. So, okay, that explains how the seeds get there, right? Someone, Moors brought it to the Spanish brought it to the Pueblos brought it to the Numic peoples. Okay, but the thing is that down the line exchange doesn't transmit the technology for raising these crops. In other words, you can take a seed, but honestly, I couldn't grow watermelon in Death Valley, right? You have to have a pre-existing knowledge of where the seasonal and perennial water sources are, where the better shaded, cooler little microclimates are, such as in particular canyons, of how the landscape funnels, holds, and absorbs water to maximize the use of a particular area. And all of these, especially for Death Valley, are very particular to that geographic region, particular to that geography and geology. And so we're not seeing these we're not seeing Western European practices being used in the late 19th century. We're seeing what is most likely a merger of um, indigenous horticultural technologies to raise successfully raise domesticated non-indigenous crops. Uh, a lot more research needs to be done into this, and there are research projects underway. But this is actually an ongoing problem within archaeology. Where do we draw the line between agriculture and horticulture? It actually gets kind of blurry, especially when the previous discourse around these topics has been uh, mostly, especially in the archaeology of Western North America, to discuss things in terms of, well, you have hunter-gatherers, nomadic peoples, and then they settle down and stop being nomadic when they start farming, um, really skipping that step of horticulture and thus engaging in a process of native erasure, really. So we need to look more into that, and that was worth revisiting. All right, next. Uh, sorry, I'm not taking calls on air. Well, if you've got questions, put them in chat. All right, moving along. Any evidence of subterranean or above ground granaries at Mesa Prieta? Well, maybe. Possibly. Not confirmed. Quite likely, but not confirmed. And this is about, excuse me, this is a part of how we operate at Mesa Prieta is we're about surveying, recording, conservation, and education. We don't really engage in data recovery or mitigation, which are the fancy terms for excavation. So it's difficult to really test. As far as subterranean, quite unlikely. The geology of Mesa Prieta, especially on the east escarpment, where we typically work, is not suitable. We don't have nice little limestone caves or sandstone overhangs. What we've got is loose conglomerate, gravels, cobbles, um, sitting underneath this hardened volcanic layer. So that hardened volcanic layer is undermined by erosion, breaks and falls. It creates these boulder-strewn slopes. On these boulder-strewn slopes, there are spaces underneath the boulders that can actually be quite large, certainly large enough to use as a shelter or for storage. However, the process by which they're formed is different from a cave. So a cave or a shelter has walls on several sides around. So it actually kind of works to protect things. But these voids, these spaces underneath the boulders, not quite so much. There's a lot of cracks and gaps and connections that would expose anything in there. One, to pests, insects, insects, vermin of all sorts, rodents. And so any kind of construction in there would have to be pretty much still around the entire storage space. You're not really gaining anything by putting it in one of these because you still have to completely enclose it. Additionally, a lot of these cavities funnel air. And so if we think about the domesticates around here, okay, by the time corn arrives, it's pretty solidly secured onto a corn cob. That's a nice solid object. But what about other domesticates like sunflowers? Well, local sunflowers, they're not what you would expect from sunflower seeds. They're incredibly tiny, probably require a lot of processing to get any nutritional value out of. And so what you end up with is something that if there's any airflow under the storage, it would spread the seeds out. And so if you left those seeds stored in there in those cavities for any amount of time, they're going to get strewn about, going to get eaten by pests, you're you're not you're not saving yourself any headaches by putting it in there. All right. So what about above ground? Probably, but we can't know for sure yet. Uh, and again, that's because we don't excavate. So we do have above ground features, um, foundations of walls, foundations of circular structures that may have been granaries, places to store the grain. Um, and they definitely fit descriptions. However, like I said, we don't excavate. So we don't have any soil samples. Why are soil samples important, right? Well, within that soil are all sorts of different traces. If shells of many seeds, especially like sunflower seeds, may preserve charred plant remains, especially when it comes to seeds. So we know this for, say, like pinyon. Charring pinyon may be a part of the process of like both preserving it and then extracting it as food. And so that leaves little bits of the shells there, right? Well, we might expect that from other things, grains and other seed crops like sunflowers. Okay, so that's possible, right? Um, that would be something that we would look for if we had soil samples. There's another thing that plants do, which is most of the Earth's crust is made of silica, and uh, silica comes from, well, silica gets pulled up into the plant. Plant doesn't have much use for it, so it deposits it in the cell walls. If you remember your like grade school biology and science class, plants have cell walls. You get this stuff deposited in or between the cell walls, add rigidity, and those remain when the rest of the plant is broken down. So what you're left with is, what you're left with are these microscopic little plant fossils made of silica that experts can identify. We would be very interested if someone came out to the Mesa and did this kind of research, did testing. Of course, you would have to get permission from landowners. If you want to work on the federal land parts, that requires permitting. So this is not a layperson thing. But if there are any researchers out there who are interested in doing these kinds of studies, who have the expertise in botanical botanical resources, please share your results with us when you get them. Maybe we'll feature you on one of these live streams. So, next question is on gender, and this was the topic for our July talk. We talked about specifically about non-binary gender, which required a foundation in gender. So one of the questions was, do current uses of DNA essentialize cisgender or binary understandings? Yes and no, and I think my answer on air was some studies do unfortunately essentialize cisgender and binary understandings of both gender and sexuality, and that's unfortunate. We see these reported widely. What I want to add to that answer from before is there's a great article from 2016 by Jan Turek, who addressed this topic in the context of Bronze Age Europe. The article, you'll see it at the end, is sex, transsexuality, and archaeological perception of gender identities. And what Turek really points out is that when we're talking about non-binary gender identities, if we are to project these onto the past, we're making an empirical fallacy, really, because many of these studies that essentialize binary gender constructions presume cisgender expressions in conjunction with the DNA and morphological evidence of human remains. Um, those those studies are based in uh, Western and specifically Christian binary gender constructions, which are very rigid. As Turek points out, the entire concept of transsexuality is in response to a system of binaries, whereas this this construction, this word that we call transsexuality, um, it sort of requires that binary to exist. It literally means going from one to another. Uh, we can't presume that was how gender systems worked, even in Bronze Age Europe, let alone, you know, more distantly here in the Americas. We do know about various ways of constructing gender at the time of contact, and I would like to refer you to that video back in July if you are interested in learning more, because I really don't want to get too far into the weeds here. Uh, but that's one of the major assumptions that can be one of the awkward ways in which DNA studies essentialize gender. Then someone's surprised when the remains of someone who was from a DNA and morphological standpoint appeared to be biologically female is accompanied with say implements of hunting and warfare. Then there's there's sort of a romantic narrative. The popular media will portray this as sort of a Mulan character, but really we need to think critically about how this might indicate that sex gender systems in the past constructed identity in fundamentally different ways from the way that we construct gender identity in the present. On that note, macaws. What do macaws have to do with gender? Well, I'll tell you. So the question comes from our talk about feasting and trade, which was August of last year. Because why wouldn't you have a feast in August? And specifically, macaws are one of those trade goods that comes from very far away. Of course, macaws are a type of parrot native to Meso and Central America, and they're well, they're parrots. They're very colorful. There's a wonderful article from Patty Crown, not that old of an article too, 2016, and she talks about macaws in the context of to understand their meaning in the Southwest, you have to understand their meaning in Mesoamerica and then the journey they have to take to get here. So in Mesoamerica, macaws are associated with the sun, the rain, with flowers, with poems, and thus with flowers and poems comes the Mesoamerican deity Xochipilli, who is believed to also have been a patron of what in a Western sex gender system would be considered homosexuality. And so this is very interesting, right? Because the very existence of the macaw in Mesoamerican iconography and its role in daily and ritual life was fundamentally connected with non-binary gender. Now we have to be careful because we can't really directly apply this to the Southwest, and it does seem that for many, maybe not all, but many of the pueblos, the sex gender systems were more rigid than some of their neighbors, such as the nomadic Numic peoples to the west, and some of the folks in Mesoamerica to the south. However, macaws don't naturally breed up here, so they have to be brought here. And this presents a number of challenges. One of which is that one of the ways that you have to raise macaws is because they mate for life. To create a stronger bond with their keeper, you don't let them have a mate, or you postpone that in their life. But because they bond with their keeper very strongly, that would make it actually very difficult to simply down the line trade, passing them from person to person. This sort of implies, now Petty Crown doesn't get into this, but this does sort of imply that someone might have to make a pilgrimage to go pick up the macaws. And who would that be? Well, there's a lot of evidence from ethnographic accounts, from iconography, and from archaeological contexts of macaw remains that while they were important to men in ceremonial life, they were probably cared for by women more often. And so this is very interesting because it implies an economic activity by women. In the procurement and distribution and keeping of macaw feathers, but it also it kind of calls into question the association of women with domestic space, because in order to develop that bond, they'd have to go on a very long distance pilgrimage to get these macaws. Now, it is possible that once macaws were brought here, they were bred in captivity. There's some physical evidence that some of this might have happened. And so, why go through this bother? Well, also there's the symbolism. Macaws are very colorful. They're associated with the rainbow. They come from the south, which is the direction of the monsoons, and also the direction in which the sun is brightest and hottest for the longest part of the year. So they are associated with the sun, with the summer monsoons, and with rainbows. Very interesting, right? All right, next. Studies on shell trade between California and the Southwest. Why is it so important? I'm just going to touch on this very briefly, and then we're going to move on. There's a article that I included by Mills and Ferguson from 2008, Animate Objects, Shell Trumpets, and Ritual Networks in the Greater Southwest. Now, they were writing specifically about shell trumpets that probably come from tropical and maybe subtropical waters, but extend this also to the shell beads from the Channel Islands. And you'll see that their argument is really about the fact that these objects have agency, that they are believed to be imbued with spirit and thus have the potential to act and negotiate their own social roles. And the object is seen as a living thing as well as a status item. So if you want to learn more, check out that article. Yeah, it's really great. Very quickly, how can we know if potsherds along trails mark pilgrimages? This is only one of the theories to explain why we find small scatters of only a couple of sherds that cannot possibly have been a pot smash. There are alternate theories, but this seems like a pretty strong one. And so it's specifically a theory for those kinds of finds where you have small numbers of potsherds, or maybe large numbers of scattered potsherds, but small amounts from each vessel, only a couple sherds. And from that, we can even skip over copper working in North and West Mexico, but there are some interesting resources on that as well. I want to get into migration a little bit, because we can jump from parrots and macaws to another bird, the roadrunner. One of the questions that came up was, are there depictions of roadrunners and turtles on Mesa Prieta? This was actually a question getting into some linguistics that we're not really going to have the time for. But here we go. Long answer, maybe. Short answer, well, um, we've got clear turtles, tortoises, turtles. There's one right there. So yes to those. Yes to Tortugas. When it comes to roadrunners, well, we've got a couple of these birds that are not typical of how uh, they're not typical of how turkeys would be depicted. So, right, this is not how we normally see turkeys depicted in rock art. Are they roadrunners? Maybe. They share certain similarities with depictions of roadrunners at other locations in the region, but it's really difficult to say for sure. Our recording strategy doesn't necessarily have a category for these, so we rely on our recorders to put this in the notes, and maybe that's something where our methods can improve. That said, we don't want to jump to conclusions, and before we add a new category or subcategory to our identification of petroglyph motifs, we really need to talk with the Tewa first to make sure we're not barking up the wrong tree. So, roadrunners, tortoises, speed, take it slow. There we go. On the topic of migration, I just wanted to point to this article about first Homo sapiens out of Africa, just like in addition to migration. This was a recent article, so this is also kind of part of archaeology in the news. Take a look at that link in the description. It's very interesting, but honestly, the evidence is really questionable. The long and short of it is we didn't think that Homo sapiens made it out of Africa before 70 to 100,000 years ago, and these are tracks from 120,000 years ago in Saudi Arabia. It's too far south for Neanderthals, so it's outside of Neanderthal range, especially from that time period. However, the study that the article is based on doesn't really address the morphological similarities between anatomically modern human feet and Homo erectus. We know that Homo erectus was out of Africa more than 1 million years ago. So we can't really be sure. All right. And then Ice Age. I've been wanting to get to this one because I forgot to explain to you. Thank you for pointing out. I forgot to explain to you about the domestication of dogs. I said this was the only domestic creature in the Americas and quite possibly in the world at the time, right? At the end of the Pleistocene, and certainly in the Americas, and it would stay that way for millennia. So what's up with the dog? Why the dog? Where does it come from? Well, there's two schools of thought. One, dogs are they may have been domesticated in one single event somewhere in Eurasia, most likely in Eurasia. That theory is gaining popularity, but there is an older theory that dogs have been domesticated multiple times. Certainly, there's a pragmatism. Of course, once you have your guard dog around, you got a better chance of staving off predators and scavengers. But they're also useful for hunting, and especially when you're mobile hunter-gatherers. Dogs are great at being nomadic, unlike cats, right? Maybe that's why we didn't get cats coming into the New World. But yeah, dogs love that nomadic lifestyle. They are great when trained at assisting with hunting. So that's the long and short of it. On the topic of, you know, animals and coming into the New World, there was another question. Did short-faced bears fend off humans, and were short-nosed bears responsible for the late arrival of humans in the Americas, especially if we're going with the coastal hopping hypothesis, when humans had already 20, 30 plus thousand years ago arrived in Australia? Uh, yeah, good question. This one was a stumper for me. Honestly, I'm still not familiar enough with the research to be able to answer. Uh, it is a legitimate hypothesis, and so that's something to consider and add to the discussion, is that aggressive predatory animals in the Arctic, in Beringia specifically, there is an outstanding theory that they may have been responsible for delaying human settlement of uh, of North and South Americas, especially if there are bottlenecks such as the inland ice-free corridor or the coastal route. If these are heavily inhabited by some kind of large aggressive bear, like the short-faced bear, then very probable. So something to consider. Again, I can't speak to the validity of this theory myself, but I do know that it is a legitimate theory. I just don't know what evidence there is for or against it. So more to come. That's it for the wrap up. Now we're going to get to archaeology in the news. First off, a quick little nod to Stefan Milo. I cited many of his videos in here. He mentioned archaeoastronomy, and so um, see the Stefan Milo reference in the references below in the description and on the last slide. Stefan mentions navigating by the Phoenician star, and so this would be Phoenician, like Carthaginian merchants, navigating by what we believe to be the North Star, and orienting in the open sea at night before the invention of the compass. That's pretty pretty impressive, and got some historical evidence to back that up. Next, going to be a little bit harder hitting. We've got this is from just a few weeks ago, an article that came out from Weiss and Springer, released by the University of Florida Press. Actually, not an article; it was a book that is very not nice. um, yeah, the author's position, which appears to be foreshadowed in some previous but still somewhat recent articles, has been that repatriation is an ideology that undermines science. First off, let's head this off at the pass. That's garbage. Um, Basically, every statement they make in this, I haven't read the full book. I have read a number of excerpts. Basically, every argument they make is a bad faith argument. There's a lot of hyperbole, a lot of exaggeration, and yeah, their uh, their position is that the repatriation of Native American remains and material culture, including grave goods, has damaged science, and they argue that Native American narratives are not valid. They believe that the they seem to believe that by engaging with Native Americans and repatriation, that we are doing a disservice to science, and simply not true. It is a very colonial attitude. It was foreshadowed by a couple of other backers, including, unfortunately, a former colleague of mine who wrote a letter to the Society of American Archaeology on SAA letterhead at closer to the start of last year. So there does seem to be an undercurrent in archaeology that is distinctly opposed to repatriation. Um, I shouldn't have to explain this to you. Keeping other people's bones without permission is bad. Um, Keeping other people's material culture, their heritage, without permission is bad. We do consultation because all of this really amounts to theft and cultural appropriation. And speaking of cultural appropriation, This guy, probably saw him in the news this week. We're going to break him down. If you don't know where this is, I don't know, you've probably been living under a rock. I'll give you a hint. That's not Nancy Pelosi right there. Yeah, so let's zoom in a bit here, because we can actually understand this guy, what he's doing there, by taking a look at him. We're going to break down the headdress, the face paint. Yeah, the stream's going to run long. Let's do this. We're going to break down the headdress, the face paint, and the tattoos. But to really get some context on that, we got to know this guy. And he's been identified based on captions from other protests and demonstrations that he has joined in on in the last year, specifically wearing much of the same regalia. So yeah, his name is out there in the press. That's a matter of public record. He self-identifies as the Q shaman. Again, we went over pronunciation back in September. Shaman is typically used in scholarly circles, but this guy, surprise, surprise, he seems to be proudly American by identity, and so yeah, probably uses the American pronunciation, shaman, rather than shaman, and probably making some kind of play on words, rhyme with a source of his disinformation. QAnon, Q shaman, you get it. It's a very bad joke. Yeah, so here he is. You can see that in previous protests, he has at once mobilized the word, well, in previous protests and on a social media account here, down there. He invokes a singular God with a capital G, so specifically the Judeo-Christian God, the Judeo-Christian patriarchal creator, but also speaks to paganism with this moniker, the Q shaman, his profile, shamanic practitioner, and his tattoos. Rough mixture here. Let's start from head to toe. First, the headdress. It is stylized off of a Sioux buffalo bonnet, or bison if you want the classification, bison. We call it the American buffalo. We can call it the buffalo. Everyone knows what you mean. This is styled after a Sioux buffalo bonnet. So there's cultural appropriation. Now, cultural appropriation is a very specific thing. It requires a certain amount of commodification, and we see that manifest in this. This is not a buffalo pelt. This is not from a buffalo head. Those horns do appear to be fake. Close-ups of this headdress show that it is most likely made out of fox fur from at least 2 different foxes, possibly more, but at least 2 foxes. So there's commodification of the pelts, most likely coming from a fur farm to create this object, which is appropriating Native American imagery. In the process of doing that, he's engaging in cultural erasure. And before I get into that, notice also the face paint, the American flag, but put on in an express reference to war paint. Again, he is involved in a very hostile demonstration, and as such, he has applied these symbols of masculinity and conflict borrowed from Native American peoples. So there's the cultural appropriation of the headdress, the cultural appropriation of the war paint, which is a part of a specific type of American Romanticism, which constructs settler colonial identity through a nativist lens. You may have seen much less problematic artwork. Often there's paintings of, say, you can imagine the wild landscape, wolves, eagles, feathers. Sometimes there's a dream catcher in there. All right. This is a part of American Romanticism. It's a part of how some people construct their identity as people who were born and raised in the United States. It's an aesthetic that's born out of the Romantic era, but it does engage in native erasure. As we see with this gentleman, that he's engaged in native erasure. He has also adorned himself with symbols of white supremacy, which we're about to get to, while taking on these symbols of Native Americans without the presence of a Native American. And that's where those paintings do get a little problematic, is that we see this appropriation of Native American religious symbolism without the Native Americans. That's what this guy is doing with the war bonnet. That is a religious symbol, and as well as a symbol of masculinity and accomplishment, and yet he's wearing it in a context where it's very clear it's not a buffalo hide. But I seriously doubt if this man has ever actually hunted a buffalo. It's very certain that he's not Sioux, because he has these images of well, Germanic, specifically Scandinavian paganism. From top to bottom, on the tattoos, we've got the linked triangles. That's the Valknut sign. That is linked to Odin, so that's a pre-Christian image. Right below it, another pre-Christian image, the Yggdrasil, the world tree, which is essentially an axis mundi, a portal between worlds that connects the heavens, which are held up by its branches, with our world, right, the trunk and the ground around it, and the underworld, the roots below it. So, and then below that, covered up by his hand, but is visible in other pictures, is a very poorly executed tattoo of Thor's hammer. So we see this appropriation of pre-Christian pagan imagery. Now, it's important to note that the use of these images by white supremacists, while common, is an act of cultural appropriation. After all, white identity as we know it and as it is constructed today is really a product of the 18th and 19th centuries, fueled by the 20th and now the 21st century. But it really traces its roots back to the 18th and 19th century. The Christianization of Europe was fairly rapid in the 9th and 10th centuries, and so before that, so in the times before the 9th and 10th centuries, when these symbols would have been commonly used, the chief means of constructing identity was based on clan systems. So in the anthropological sense, it was very tribalistic, but the concept of race was not really something that existed as we know it today. So yeah, that guy. Broken down. All right. And of course, the appropriation of the term shaman and shamanism. Again, he's clearly not a practitioner of a modern heathen or pagan religion, and these terms are used by practitioners of these religions. Unfortunately, because of the appropriation of this imagery by white supremacists, typically now the preferred term is heathen, as the white supremacists have taken on the term pagan. It's unfortunate, but modern practitioners have come out and denounced this man and other folks like him for including this pagan imagery in a context that was never really meant to be in. And that's also what he's doing with the word shaman and shamanism and shamanic, is that he is appropriating a pre-Christian word while at the same time invoking the Judeo-Christian central creator deity. So we can tell that he's not really a practitioner of these religions. All right, we're done with problematic man and cultural appropriation. We covered repatriation. I want to move on to the next slide because that guy makes me angry. If you liked any of the topics that we covered today, here you go. Here's a number of references that you can follow. I tried to keep it short for this talk. I thought this talk was going to run short, and we're actually running a bit long. So, like I said, we're not worried about running out of content. But yeah, go ahead, explore some more, and we'll see you next week. I don't see any comments in the chat. So unless anyone has any comments, I think that's a wrap for this week. If you do think of a question or a comment to add, you can always email me. You can find my email on our website, mesaprietapetroglyphs.org. You can reach out to us on social media, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. And maybe that question will be on air in a later roundup. So yeah, that's it for this week. Thank you. Glad you enjoyed the information. I'm gonna sign off. Till next month. Y'all take care. Stay safe. And I need to